Well, thank you. I'm glad to be anywhere these days, so glad to be here with you. Thank you, Colleen. Thank you, Rick. Thank you to the Friends of the Institute and to the Jung Center, but mostly thank you to you. It's surprising is no longer the word I use because I'm getting used to people showing up to talk about grief. When I first started giving talks about grief and writing about grief, there were very small numbers of people in the audience. But now, this is not unusual. So I'm very grateful that you've chosen to spend a Sunday afternoon talking about sorrow and the apprenticeship with sorrow. I also want to acknowledge the ancestors and the ancestral lineage that I'm part of that are connected to the Jung Center. I'll share more about that in a minute. But also to the Ohlone people who were the original inhabitants of this land, that we are the invaders to this space. And so we have to acknowledge that that's also part of the grief that we carry in our bones, is what happened to the original people of this continent. So I'll begin with a couple stories and a couple poems so that we can kind of settle into the idea of soul work and working with grief. The first story is when I was licensed at 27 years old to do psychotherapy. I don't know why they gave me a license at 27, but that's not my fault. They did. But I was smart enough to know I didn't know anything about therapy. And so I called the Jung Institute and said, I'm looking for a mentor. I'm looking for someone I can apprentice with. And they gave me a bunch of names. And one of the names was a man named Clark Berry. And when I talked to Clark, I said, this is the man I want to sit with. And I showed up at his doorstep one day in 1983, and he opened the door, and my God, he was ancient. He was like 60 years old. I mean, so old. And we sat down, and the very first thing he taught me, he reached over and he patted this big rock he had by his chair. He said, this is my clock. I operate at geologic speed. And if you're going to work with the soul, this is the rhythm you need to learn. And he pointed at his clock and said, it hates this. That was the single most important thing I ever learned about doing therapy, was how do you slow people down to the rhythm of soul so they can pay attention to what soul is speaking to them through their symptoms, through their sorrows, through all the neglected parts of their life. And most people coming in the door are in an extreme hurry to change. And underneath that hurry is often self-hatred. I'm not enough. I don't belong. I'll never make it. And so we have to disavow that premise from the very beginning by slowing them down and coming into the speed of soul. So I'm very grateful to the Jung Institute for introducing me to Clark Berry. The second one is a dream I had in 1992. I'm sitting at a dining room table with James Hillman, and he gets up and goes over to a closet, opens the door, and there's a chest of drawers in there, but the drawers are very narrow. And he opens every drawer and pulls out a sheet of paper out of every drawer, and on that is written the bibliography of a writer, starting with Jung. And I went down through Vico and Ficino, all the way down to Heraclides. And he turned to me and said, this is your family tree. I was claimed by a heritage. We have a genealogical heritage, but we also have a soul lineage. And that lineage has been so deeply helpful for me over the course of the last 40 years of trying to learn how to be with soul, personally, with my people I work with, but also communally and collectively, and now planetarily. So all praise to my mentors, my teachers, my lineage, which include Robert Stein and Clark and Hillman and many, many, many others. So two poems I'd like to share. One is a poem, a very short poem by Denise Levertov, the Seattle-based poet. She said, to speak of sorrow works upon it, moves it from its crouched place, barring the way to and from the soul's hall. To speak of sorrow works upon it, moves it from its crouched place, barring the way to and from the soul's hall. It's a very instructive little poem, that if you want to be in touch with soul, you need to learn the speech of sorrow, right? Otherwise, there will be something obstructing your relationship to soul. Soul is incredibly comfortable in the labyrinth and the layers of grief. That's its home ground. Vulnerability, depth, intimacy, suffering, loss, grief. The second poem goes from a premise that we work with in the grief work that I've been doing for the past many, many years, is that the mark of a mature human being is to carry grief in one hand and gratitude in the other, and to be stretched large by these two presences in our life. To carry either one misses the mark. If I only pick up grief, over time I will become cynical and bitter. If I only pick up gratitude, I will lack a certain depth of compassion for other people's suffering. But together, they stretch us immensely. And if you pay attention, on any given day, they are both there simultaneously. The deepest sorrow, I drive in from my home to my office in Santa Rosa. It's about a 25-minute drive through redwoods and grapevines, and almost every day there is a dead creature on the side of the road. A fox, a possum, a skunk, sometimes a hawk or an owl. And my heart goes into that animal and feels it. And the next thing I see is the sun coming over the clouds, and simultaneously I'm touched by both presences in my life. This is our deep work, is to hold both of those. So this is a poem by Mark Nepo. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Mark's work and his writings and his poetry. This is Mark's version of this grief-gratitude tension. It's called Adrift. Everything is beautiful, and I am so sad. Everything is beautiful, and I am so sad. This is how the heart makes a duet of wonder and grief. The light spraying through the lace of the fern is as delicate as the fibers of memory forming their web around the knot in my throat. The breeze makes the birds move from branch to branch, as this ache makes me look for those I've lost in the next room, in the next song, in the laugh of the next stranger. In the very center, under it all, what we have that no one can take away, and all that we've lost face each other. It is there that I'm adrift, feeling punctured by a holiness that exists inside everything. I am so sad, and everything is beautiful. So just a little background. So I've been doing therapy for about 40 years, just 1 year shy of that anniversary. And over the course of that long apprenticeship, you begin to see what's at the heart of grief, of most therapy is grief work. It's surrounded by loss of innocence in childhood, the loss of a secure childhood, loss of marriages, loss of friendships through death, through suicide, loss of spouses, children. It's saturated with loss. Most of the people who come into my office, one of their primary complaints is depression. But when you sit with it, it's really not depression, it's oppression. It is centuries, oftentimes, of unmetabolized sorrow. Not even their own griefs only, but generations of untouched sorrows settle on most people like sediment, weighing us down, pushing us to the ground, where it's almost hard to get up off the ground. Anybody understand what I'm talking about? Nobody? Okay. Yeah. So this is the lingering sediment of unmetabolized grief, and it's generations old. In the mid-90s, I began working with ritual practices and saw the tremendous impact that ritual had on the ways that human beings move sorrow through their bodies. So I began in the late 90s, early 2000s, offering grief rituals. And again, when I first offered those, we had to convince people that it would be a good idea to spend the weekend weeping together. And now, within a couple hours, the workshops are full. Something seems to have shifted over these last 20 or 30 years in the collective awareness of the culture. We can't deny that things are falling apart. We can't deny that our planet is in great peril. We can't deny that our culture is fractured and distorted in its ways of doing community. We actually don't have a culture. We have a loose associated society. We don't have living culture. Living cultures would know how to process grief. They would know how to give thanks. They would know how to take their young ones through initiation rites. They would know how to escort us into elderhood and how to become good ancestors. But almost none of that exists. And believe me, this is at the heart of our grief. What we have forgotten is at the heart of our sorrow. We have people coming from Australia and England, Canada, all across the United States to come to our grief rituals, just to have the privilege of being able to grieve side by side with another human being. And we thank them profusely for coming. But again, this should be happening in every community, at least monthly, that we empty the cup of our communal sorrow. And frequently the cup fills faster than a month. But this is not part of our daily round. This is part of the heart of our loss. We have forgotten how to tend the soul of the people. I often say the two primary sins in white and late capitalist patriarchal culture are amnesia and anesthesia. We forget and we've gone numb. We forget how entangled our lives are with the soil, with the air, with the water, with the animals, with one another, with the ancestors. We forget how completely entangled we are in our lives together. And the anesthesia arises out of what we have forgotten. It's almost too painful to stay open to this life. So we have entire industries devoted to anesthetizing our people. The alcohol industry, the entertainment industry. I'm not saying there's not some value in these things. We're going to have wine later on. I'm here, But the level at which we rely upon this to not feel, to cope, to get by in an empty culture is symptomatic of what it is we're grieving. In the absence of living culture, what we've really come to rely upon is this heroic ideal. That's the primary fantasy in this culture. It's the remnant, basically, of individualism. You're on your own, basically, is the ideal. To never admit vulnerability, to never show weakness, to always be in control, to never let someone see you needy or vulnerable. These ideals deprive us of the right to lean into other human beings in times of loss. And what I'm seeing now, because of the complexity of our grief situation, is the need is almost constant. Our need to move and process sorrow is pretty much constant. We don't have periods of mourning anymore after the death of someone close to you. We have constant, chronic presence of sorrow. And when you're asked to do this alone, it's unbearable. It's overwhelming. And so just a quick word of praise for numbness. The heart is wise. And the heart knows that without the proper conditions to open this up and to really be held in this adequately, it's not a bad idea to shut down. But what I've seen literally thousands of times in our ritual work is that when the condition is offered and that channel opens up, that grief moves almost automatically. It's waiting for the signal frequency that our deep time ancestors knew by heart. Because every one of us comes from a collective people, an indigenous culture, when we go back to our own deep story, that knew how to grieve together, that knew how to give thanks, and do all the things that were required to keep the culture alive. Otherwise, it would not have survived. The oldest archaeological remnants we know of are burials. Some of them are over 300,000 years old. We've been doing grief rituals for 300,000 years, and probably longer. Right? That's what we know of, and that's what we have forgotten. Not everybody. The other part of this heroic idea is that we must always be improving, getting better, stronger. I have people come into my office someday after a week of seeing them and says, God, I think I regressed this week. I'll often say, fantastic. I'm so glad. Just for a moment to step out of this heroic fixation with progress, as if that's the only direction we can go in. I've never, ever seen the soul be one-dimensional or one-directional. The soul meanders and wanders and descends and goes backwards and stays still. It moves wildly like a creature in the woods. And we keep trying to push it on this arrow of progress. This is insulting to the soul. It's insulting to our own beings. So there's this kind of forced positivism of always getting it right, transcending the negative states. We were doing a grief ritual once at a respected institution, and there was many other workshops going on on the facility. And people walked by our room and they went, oh, it's so negative in there. Can you feel how bummed out people are in there? Yeah, we're dealing with grief. But to call it negative is, again, part of this binary projection of what's good and what's bad, what is right and what is wrong. And because of this, we've created what I call a flatline culture. We have a very narrow range of what it is we are allowed to feel in these bodies. And when we collapsed the deep register of sorrow, we watched the register of joy full as well. We don't have joy. We have excitement. We have stimulation. We have lottery games and roller coasters and Wall Street. But we don't really know a lot about joy. I remember reading an interview with Matthew Fox. People know Matthew Fox. He was the former Catholic priest, Episcopal priest now, and brilliant writer. He was talking to a priest who just came back from South America. And he said, why did you go down there? He said, well, I had this idea that I was going to teach them about things. He said, I quickly gave that up. What did you learn? He said, joy. So they feel more joy in one day than we do in a year. I mean, that's, again, part of our grief, is that we've lost access to joy, to delight, to enchantment, to wonder, to awe. This is our loss. We've been told to be enamored with cell phones and fast computers. And I mean, they're amazing, but they're not enchanting. They don't speak to me from the place of soul as much. So when grief arises after all of these conditioning that we've gone through, when it arrives at our door, which is inevitable, we feel overwhelmed. We don't know how to meet this guest at the door. In fact, we try to find better ways to lock the door, to keep it out. When I'm working, I rarely see a pure moment of grief. What I witness is grief panic, grief fear, as if we become petrified and terrified of this encounter. People will say to me in my office, when we're getting close to that feeling state, if I go there, I'm never coming back. And what I say to them, if you don't go there, you're never coming back. Because so much of our vitality and our aliveness is locked up in the process of trying to prevent grief from entering the room. Grief is not depression, people. Grief is wild. It is feral. It is riddled with energy and life force. When we're in grief, you can barely move. You have been so shaken by this energy that we don't know how to welcome it and know how to move it. So we are mostly frightened of it. Does this make sense, what I'm saying? Yeah? Okay. So far we've been talking about our personal encounters with grief. But the last 2.5 years have really shown us that much of the grief we're feeling isn't even personal anymore. It is collective. It is planetary. The pandemic shook everything. Our confidence in the future. We've watched over 1 million people in this country alone die. We've watched many of our friends get sick. We have some dear friends right now who are dealing with long COVID. Don't know how he's going to be able to kind of muster his energy to come back to full life. So this last 2 years have been a time really punctuated by a series of losses. And we don't have the means by which collectively to address it. So it sits in our laps, it sits on our backs, it sits in our hearts as congestive heart failure. Our hearts are clogged with this. And it's left us with feelings of uncertainty, anxiety, grief. And this is the ambient field. And every one of us is feeling it. Every one of us is dealing with this on a day-by-day basis. And now we've just begun to imagine the possibility that this species may not go further down the road too much longer. That the conditions that we are creating may actually abort this incredible life experiment of human life. Where do you put that? What drawer do you put that in? How do you hold that without adequate means of moving it and keeping it alive and going forward? On the other side of this, the good news is, the better news is that what the pandemic did and what we're beginning to sense out with the global situation is that the fantasy of insulation and isolation is cracking. The idea that I'm somehow separate from all of that is falling to the wayside. We are in complete entanglement with the living world. There is no insulation. We are completely entangled with kelp forests and calving glaciers and disappearing species. That's in our body. It's in our blood. How could it not be? The soul evolved in the same matrix as everything else on this planet. Over the last several 100,000 years, our souls were given shape by that conversation with birdsong and rainstorm, thunder, silent nights of stars and fires. That's what gave us our shape. So I think it was last year, maybe the year before, a survey came out of Britain asking 10,000 young adults from 16 to 25 their views of the future. What came back was pretty startling. Nearly 60% of the young people said they were very worried or extremely worried about their futures. 45% questioned and said feelings about the climate change affected their daily lives. Almost half of the youth. Daily lives are being affected by this. 3/4, 75% of them thought the future was frightening, and over half think that we are doomed. This is what we're handing off to the young. This is part of the grief in my body as an elder. 2/3 reported feeling sad, afraid, and anxious, feeling fear, anger, despair, grief, and shame that this is what we've done. What's that lovely line of Machado? What have you done with the garden entrusted to you? What have we done with this garden entrusted to us? It goes on and on from there. If you're interested, it's a very important study to look at. So we are living what I call in a time of endings. This is the time of collapse on many levels. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. We live up in Sonoma County. We have certainly had to deal with the endings of In a sense, we lived in our home for, I guess, 15 years before we had our first fire scare. Since then, we've been out of our home several weeks from evacuations as the fires came within a half a mile of our home. So we're living in what Buddha says, everything is burning. Everything is burning. That doesn't mean a literal burn, but also means the floods in Pakistan or in Kentucky. Everything is being disrupted. Everything that we took for granted is being dislodged and disoriented. And we need places of shelter. We need places to gather and begin to hold all of this. Otherwise, our little boat of self will keep feeling swamped and overwhelmed. We need resources. We are frequently asked again to face this alone, in isolation. And how the hell do we do that? So I was recently asked to write a book, write a preface for a very powerful book by Jung called Choosing Earth. Dwayne has been working this material for over 50 years. He's about to turn 80. And the problem for this book is I had to read it to write the preface for it. And the reading is hard. He looks at the next 5 decades of human life and what to expect. Based on all of the forecast models, all of the prognosis he can make from gathering tons and tons of data, the next 5 years, in fact 5 decades, are going to be very challenging. And when I read that, what came out of my mouth and out onto the page was that the keynote for the coming decades will be grief. There will be losses upon losses upon losses. Species, water, food, safety, security, future. This is hard to face. This is really hard to face. We are entering what I call the long dark. And the long dark, thanks again to Jung's work with alchemy, gave me a way to begin to imagine what's happening to us, not as cataclysmic, but as potentially transformative. That certain things can only happen in the darkness, like your heartbeat, like the roots under the ground, gathering nutrients and microbes, and all of this happening in the darkness. And in Jung's work, he was able to draw wisdom from a very ancient arcane tradition called alchemy, which I think many of you know. And one of the images in alchemy is the idea of the negredo, the blackening. And the negredo in the alchemical tradition was called the subtle dissolver. I don't think things are so subtle right now, but things are definitely dissolving. And if we use this metaphor and this imagery, we can begin to see that there's wisdom in it. The negredo in the alchemical tradition was a time of dissolution, of things falling apart, of decay, of breakdown, of collapse. That was the beginning of the opus. That was the beginning of the great work. Right now we have things that must collapse and decay, like systemic racism, like economic disparities, like gender injustice, like marginalization of our LGBTQ communities. These things must collapse. So maybe there's something in this long dark that isn't so much fatalistic, but an invitation to participate in radical transformation of the core constituents of living culture. Does that make sense what I'm saying? This is the work in our laps right now, no matter what age you are. This is the work in our laps. To enter into the long dark as a collaborator, as a participant, to see that that's where we are. This is not a time of confidence and rising. It is not a time of ease and success. We are going down. We are in this deep descent right now, in both senses of that word. We are dissenting against oppressive systems, but we're also descending down. And as we all know from Jung's work, down is the direction of soul. We are not doing the ascension work at this time. We are not rising up. We're being asked to learn the work of descent, to go down, to be on our knees, to weep together. There's this wonderful idea in the Inuit tradition called Kartsaluni. How many of you have ever heard that term, Kartsaluni? Okay. Kartsaluni is a term that means sitting together quietly in the darkness, waiting expectantly for something to arise. So they're not out trying to figure the solution. They're sitting quietly, collectively in the darkness, waiting patiently for something creative to arise. We're not going to figure our way out of the long dark. We've had all the information we've needed for decades. All the information we possibly could have needed, we had to avert where we are right now. So something else is being required of us. We have to learn the ways and rituals and patterns of soul. We have to learn to see in the dark. This is a very different way for us to be. Like I said, we are heading down, and down is holy ground to the soul. Rilke, the German poet, Rainer Maria Rilke, said that no matter how deeply I go down into myself, my God is dark, and like a webbing made of 100 roots that drink in silence. And yet, no matter how deeply I go down into myself, my God is dark, and like a webbing made of 100 roots that drink in silence. We need to resuscitate the holiness that dwells in the dark. Again, in our very polarized binary system, light is good, dark is bad. And this has created a tremendous disparity in where we look to find resource and inspiration and depth of being. We must recover the holiness that lives in the dark. Spanish poet Federico Garcia Lorca said, we are being baptized by dark waters. Again, not about ascension. We are being taken down. This is a very unsettling feeling, by the way, for any of us, because we're not taught much about what happens in the darkness. We're always supposed to be rising up. So this is a time of loss and disorientation, and it's also a time, again, of great vulnerability. This is when we have to pick up our apprenticeship with sorrow. We were hoping we'd get there, right? That we'd finally talk about the apprenticeship. Okay. So this is like what I call the core preparatory curriculum for the long dark. How to prepare ourselves to participate in the long dark. And it's these skills that we're going to be talking about that really enable us to stay present to the larger expression of soul, what the alchemists call the anima mundi, the soul of the world. That our personal inflection of soul is completely corresponding to what is happening in the larger body of the anima mundi, the soul of the world. When people come into my office nowadays, frequently the material they're presenting is not personal. It's not intrapsychic. They're talking about fears for their children's future. They're talking about fears of what's happening in the street or the pandemic, or they're talking about their own worries about economics. They're talking about the world. The patient is now as much the world as it is the individual. So we cannot just treat ourselves as an insulated presence. We are feeling the sorrows and suffering in the world in our flesh, in our bones, in our bodies. They're completely and utterly entangled. So this apprenticeship is a form of ripening of our own psychic capacities, coaxing the hidden qualities of soul out into the world. Okay. Want to take a breath? Are you okay? We doing all right? The door's still unlocked in case you have to. All right, thank you. So John O'Donohue, the Irish poet and philosopher, and, who died way too young in my opinion, he said, life is a growth in the art of loss. What a strange statement. Life is a growth in the art of loss. See, in our Western psychological system, our growth is always about acquiring, about gaining more, about being more this, more integrated, more whole, more alive, or more integrated. But he's saying life is a growth in the art of loss, of shedding, of letting go. And I like that he called it an art, because that implies skill, craftsmanship, capacity. It implies soul making, to use one of Hillman's terms. And the reason why this is important is that we cannot deny that grief is perennial and pervasive. It is always around us. On any given day, something will strike you. From the internet, from walking down the streets, from news of your family, something will touch your heart with sorrow. And again, much of it is not personal. In my book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, I talk about the 5 gates of grief, which we don't have time to go into today, but that grief is not just about losing someone you love or something you love. There are many other ways in which grief comes into our beings every day, including the sorrows of the world, including ancestral grief, including the erosion to our own sense of integrity and wholeness, when parts of us are fractured off through shame, through trauma. So if it's ever present, we need to become skillful in knowing how to engage it when it's there. What I find valuable about this idea of apprenticeship is that it suggests a long study. A long study. We like going to a weekend workshop and saying, well, I've got that now, you know. But what if we begin to reimagine this old idea of apprenticeship, like they did for hundreds of years? And still to this day, there are apprenticeship programs that last usually several years. Typically, it was 5 to 20 years you would study a craft, like painting or becoming a farrier, working with metals, or a stonemason, or a weaver, or a potter. You would study and study and study until you became what would be called a master of that art. In soul work, in the apprenticeship with sorrow, the goal is never mastery. The goal, if we want to use that language, the outcome of that fidelity to that apprenticeship is not mastery, it is elderhood. If you stay faithful to the work of grief and you keep finding ways to metabolize it and transmute it into medicine for your community, ultimately you will arrive at the doorstep of an elder. You will be an elder. And this is what we need so much right now. We have a lot of young ones coming through our grief work, and our lectures and talks. And what I notice is so much, like that study just said, is how much the weight of the world is on their hearts, in their bodies, in their souls. And if they don't get seen by those of us who can witness, they feel abandoned and betrayed by this generation. So it is our job, talking to all of our gray hairs up here, it's our job to learn how to become fluent in the language of grief, so that when we see it on the street, when we meet it in a young person's eyes, we don't avert the gaze. We stay present with it, and we say, I see you. I don't have any answers, but I see the grief in your face. And I'll sit with you. I'll talk to you. So it begins with a prolonged period of study and immersion. And we begin with a conversation with the materials itself. When you began let's say you were learning to be a carpenter, you never touched a saw or a hammer, probably until your second or third year. The first years, you just swept shavings off the floor. You just watched them working. You didn't touch the materials. If you're studying painting, you might learn, they might teach you how to mix pigments in the right way or clean brushes, but you would not put any paint on canvas until you showed a devotion to the material itself. Now think about that in our own work with grief. What would a devotion to the material itself look like? To not turn away, to engage it, to let the leaden weight of sorrow be felt in your body, to share with other people, to work with its intense emotions, excuse me, and the difficult cargo that soul brings to our doors, to work with it. So we begin as a novice, as a beginner, humbly and simply. There's a wonderful poem by Rilke. He said, "It's possible. I am pushing through solid rock in flint-like layers as the ore lies alone. I am such a long way in, I see no way through and no space. Everything is close to my face, and everything close to my face is stone. I don't have much knowledge yet in grief, so this massive darkness makes me small. You be the master. Make yourself fierce. Break in. Then your great transforming will happen to me, and my great grief cry will happen to you." He wrote that at 27 years old. I don't know how he wrote that. We may have matured a little faster back then. But do you hear the brilliance of the self-compassion in that? I don't have much knowledge yet in grief. Everything, all my grief is right here. I can barely see beyond the next step. Have you ever felt that way in your life? When the next step, you didn't even know how to put the next footfall. But then he makes this extraordinary plea. I sat with this poem for literally probably 8 to 10 years, and I still don't know if I have it understood. But when he said, "You be the master," my first association for my conditioning was God. He was talking about God. You be the master, God. But after sitting with people in grief ritual after grief ritual, it's sorrow I think he's talking to. You be the master. Sorrow. Make yourself fierce. Break in. Then your great transforming will happen to me. And this is what happens when we let grief break in. We are changed. We are radically altered by grief's work on our souls. Deepened, ripened, made ready for our participation in the world as adult human beings. There is no maturation without a deep, lasting, lingering relationship with grief. This is required material. So when he says, "You be the master," praying to sorrow to break through. And then what is his gift back? My great grief cry will happen to you. That's the covenant between sorrow. And if you remember, William Blake said that emotions are divine influxes. They're not yours. Psychology, or Western psychology, is so damn acquisitive. Like, these are my feelings. What if they're divine influxes? What if sorrow comes to your door and asks for entry? Can you treat it like a divine presence and let them have their way to work you and deepen you? And again, no expectation if the invitation is being met and you're all alone. This is too much. We're getting to what part of the apprenticeship is. How are we doing on time? Okay. Yeah, I never talk linearly, so. So the idea is, as we metabolize and become more fluid and fluent in the language of grief, we develop a certain gravitas, a certain weightiness to our being. And gravitas is a good word because it has the same root as the word grief. It comes from gravis. Gravis means heavy, where we get the words grave, gravity, grief. In French, when a woman is pregnant, she's gravid, right? She's heavy with child. So there's a certain heaviness. We're being taken down again in the weightiness, the gravity of grief. So we're being asked to build muscle here, skill, and a robust spaciousness that welcomes what arrives at the door. James Hillman was asked a question once. He said, well, what is the goal of the work? He said, well, the goal is rarely resolution. The goal is spaciousness. Not to resolve the problems of our life, but to become spacious enough to hold them in a compassionate, caring way. So I want to share a couple premises with you about the apprenticeship, and then pray to God we can get through the rest of the notes. Okay. The first premise is that grief is not only an emotion, but a core human faculty. Grief is not just an emotion, but a core skill, a core human faculty. It's there wired into us. So we want to become skillful in this terrain so that we can turn towards the sorrows that we encounter. If we feel unskilled, incapable, we won't turn towards it. We'll keep trying to find the exit door. How do I get away from this? Right? So when we can find that way of meeting it, that's when we turn the material of grief into the tincture of medicine for the community. This is pure alchemy. Taking lead, the dense, heavy, weighted material of loss, and transmuting that into something precious, the opus, our gift, our medicine. It takes tremendous psychic strength to stay open to grief when it arrives at our door. To deal with the heat of the loss, the chaotic emotions, the difficult memories, those are what arrive at our door. And it takes tremendous psychic strength to stay present to all of this. So the apprenticeship, like we said, is long. The second premise is that grief works us in profound ways. We are reshaped day by day by this encounter. And at the same time, we are asked to work grief. Okay? Not only does grief work us, but we're asked to work grief. It is not a passive process. Frequently, we're just trying to endure the grief that comes at our door, trying to get to the other side of it. But this is not about endurance. It's really about engagement. How do I engage the grief that's come to my door? The idea, again, is not just endurance to get to this side, but it's also depth. How do we help ourselves become deepened by this encounter with grief? And the third premise is that our apprenticeship is a sustained practice in the art of vesseling. And what I mean by that is that, again, going back to the alchemical imagery that Jung helped us to recover and reclaim, is that we're trying to learn how to hold, contain, separate, and warm the materials that arrive in our encounters with grief. This is an old alchemical premise that whatever is in the vessel must be kept warm. This is a very critical idea. How do we keep the material warm? Most of the time, when we turn away from avoidance, from disinterest, from distrust, grief hardens and congeals and becomes immovable in our hearts and our souls. It's frozen, stuck. So the work is keep the material warm. Come to it with affection, with interest, with curiosity, with your efforts, like writing, drawing, painting, dancing. I mean, the Red Book, well, we could spend a whole time doing this one. In the Red Book, the primary conversation Jung's having is with the dead, right? And what did he hear from the dead? The lament of the dead. That we don't feel honored. We don't feel you grieving us adequately. We don't feel you paying attention to us. So even then, we have to come back to the core ground of learning how to keep the material warm, keep the grief moving. We are not meant to be permanent containment fields for grief. The Spanish poet Jaime Gil de Biedma said that I believed I wanted to be a poet, but deep down, I just wanted to be a poem. That's it. Grief work, when we do it faithfully, gets us a little bit more into that moment, feeling of being current, of being in this moment of life. Most of our lives, we're facing our histories. We're backing our ways into the grave. We rarely get here fully because we're still digesting not only our sorrows, like I said, but typically generations and generations of sorrow that have not been adequately held. But the idea is to get current. We have people who have come to, ritual after ritual after ritual. And I remember when I first started doing this work, I thought, well, why do these traditional cultures keep doing the ritual? They've got it. Well, then I got it. They're successful because they keep doing the rituals. I spent some time in a village in Western Africa, and on most any given day, there was a grief ritual going on, someplace in the village. And I remember coming up to one woman, and I just said, "You have so much joy." And her response to that was, "Well, that's because I cry a lot." Wow. Not because I shop a lot or I keep myself busy, just got a new car. No, there's a direct relationship, like I said before, that lower registers lived in that community. And so there's adequate joy. There's an abundance of joy there for them to touch. There's definitely more verb than noun in that community. They are living. It was the third poorest country in the world. So our approach, how we approach our grief, is critically important. So I want to explore the 6 elements of the apprenticeship with sorrow right now. So I'll take a breath. You're doing great. So the approach to sorrow is critical. So before the 6 practices, I'll share another passage by John O'Donohue. And these 2 sentences have basically formed like an anthem in my lifetime. He said, what we encounter, recognize, or discover depends to a large degree upon the quality of your approach. When we approach with reverence, great things decide to approach us. Wow. What we encounter, recognize, or discover depends to a large degree upon the quality of your approach. When we approach with reverence, great things decide to approach us. We're back in Rilke's poem. He approached that energy with reverence. You be the master. And then something greater approached him, right? We rarely approach our grief with reverence. It's usually with fear. In my practice, again, there's this feeling, and I know that in my own life too, from my own experiences of shame, when we approach that territory, it feels bottomless. And so we don't want to go in there because we will be forever in free fall. So part of the work of the apprenticeship is learning how to give grief a bottom. Learning how to trust it again, okay? Because it's going to be there. All right, the first element in the apprenticeship is establishing a right relationship with sorrow. A right relationship with sorrow. And what I mean by that is kind of getting out of the binary relationship with sorrow. We tend to either push it away or we drown in it. What we want to do is cultivate a third option. How many are familiar with the work of Eugene Genlin? focusing work, a few of you. His work was so beautifully articulated in teaching us this move. How do I come in relationship with what is present in my emotional field without either trying to push it away or being overwhelmed? How do I establish a companionship with grief? How do I imagine befriending grief and walking with it? That might take a while. It might be an uneasy friendship at first, but ultimately, can you imagine walking with grief side by side for the rest of your life? It's there anyway. It's like the 13th fairy in the fairy tales. The one that doesn't get invited, that's the one that screws things up. So when we don't invite grief in, it's still going to come back again as depression, as oppression, as anxiety. It will show up again. So just trying to imagine coming into a living relationship. The second skill is to develop a practice. It's essential that you have some way of creating ground underneath your feet, whether that's meditation or prayer or dance or writing, knitting. It doesn't really matter what form you take, but it matters that you have a form, that you have something, so that when the strong winds of deep grief come at you, whether that's your own disappearance or someone close to you or whatever we're hearing in culture, when those storms hit the shore, your boat doesn't capsize. There's a wonderful image I got from, forgot her name. I'll get it. But she wrote a book called Hold Fast. And in the book, Kathleen Dean Moore, how could I forget? She's the front piece for my book. But Kathleen Dean Moore wrote many books, but one of them was called Hold Fast. And a hold fast, some of you are familiar with ocean life, is the chemical bond between the kelp root structure and the rock beneath it. So there's a chemical bond. So when these storms come, they move a lot, but that bond helps them to stay steady and rooted. That's what a practice does for us. It gives us some place to feel held and rooted so we don't get blown away and blown over. We're also creatures of great forgetfulness, so practice helps us to keep remembering 3 primary questions: who I am, where I belong, and what is sacred. If you can keep those as kind of your orientation, it gives you a way to stay steady in the world. Who I am, where I belong, and what is sacred. Now this third one, we could spend several days talking about, which is staying present in the adult. Staying present in the adult. And what I mean by this is that frequently when grief arises in our life, we oftentimes feel very inept and unable to hold the grief. It's almost as if we feel like a 5-year-old child. And I can tell you literally this happens in the room working with grief rituals. When that grief really comes in, I can watch the room and just see certain faces turn into very young children. And all this is telling me is that that grief was never really adequately held as that child, in that child's life. So when grief arises, that bottomless feeling comes up, and there's this quick regression into what Jung, in one of his most brilliant discoveries, called the complex. That the psyche can split off entire portions of consciousness, and they remain autonomous, functioning pieces of consciousness, but we don't even know they're there until the circumstances arrive, like when grief comes in the door. Suddenly I go from being a 66-year-old man to a 5-year-old boy. Does that make sense? So the work is so crucial to teach people how to migrate, how to transmit this from the child's hands into the adult's hands. Learning over time how to have faith that I can hold this. I can be present to this. And one of the simplest moves I make in those moments when someone flashes that child's look towards me, and I can just say to them, tell me what's happening for you right now. They frequently say, I got to get out of here. I'm not safe. And I'll say, can you imagine turning toward that part of you that doesn't feel safe and saying, I'm here with you? Can you imagine being there with this part of you that doesn't feel safe? And the moment they do that, they've done what Jung said is so crucial, which is that we can't heal what we can't separate from. So if we can't get separation from the complex in that moment, you're reduced to the skill set of a child. Is that making sense? That's why frequently we repeat this material over and over again, because the skill set is not there to resolve and move the grief. The skill set in trauma or in the child or in the complex is survival. Thank God that part learned how to survive, but did not learn how to move and resolve what is there. I would like to take much more time, but we can't do that. The fourth practice is silence and solitude. Now, I had to add this one over the years because people kept saying, well, I'm a strong introvert. And you keep saying how important community is in working with grief. And I said, well, and it is. It's crucial to working with grief. But I realize that much of the time you're working with your grief, you'll be alone. And how do you turn it from isolation and endurance to silence and solitude? How do you make that move ripened so that it becomes holy territory? You know, silence where it becomes a form of hospitality to what is most tender in you, where you're listening deeply to hear the quieter voices, the parts that oftentimes don't get listened to, or that listening grants a certain courtesy of attention, like you're really befriending what is most tender inside of you, and listening. And solitude is a deep bow to the soul's need for time alone. The soul, Bob Stein, I don't know if you ever ran into Bob's work as a Jungian analyst. He wrote some very important pieces. One of them was called The Betrayal of Soul in Psychotherapy, put out by Spring Publications. Bob said the soul has a simultaneous need for intimacy and freedom. I've got to talk about it. The soul has a simultaneous need for intimacy and sovereignty. It needs both simultaneously, like a double helix. It moves in and out of this need almost on a daily basis. Sometimes I absolutely require my alone time. And sometimes I need to be with friends. I need their companionship. I need their company. And I have to listen to see what that oscillation feels like. So I remember silence and solitude can also be uncomfortable for people because they're alone with what's unresolved in their souls. I was working with one woman, and she said, you know, I hate going home at night. I just hate it. She was going through a very ugly divorce. I said, what's that like for you? She said, well, I walk in the door, it's cold, it's dark, it's lonely. I said, well, can you imagine it as the holiest time of day? That when you open the door, you're greeting the most vulnerable part of your life. The part of you that feels lonely, that feels abandoned, that feels sad and full of sorrow. Can you imagine saying, let's put on the tea, let's warm the soup, let's start the fire. And then I remembered another line of Rilke's where he said, I am too alone in the world, but not alone enough to make every moment holy. Whoa. I am too alone in the world. We all know that feeling, right? Too isolated, too cut off. But then he makes this pivot, but not alone enough to make every moment holy. Again, there's the beauty of silence and solitude. To make that turn, that every moment will fail 95% of the time, but even if just a few moments feel that fertile and rich of homecoming, That's beautiful. Excuse me. The fifth one is self-compassion. This is a core piece of your apprenticeship, all of our apprenticeship, mine as well. I think this is the heart of all good therapy is compassion work. And when I do weekends on self-compassion, I usually begin by saying this is a weekend in non-self-improvement. Because again, people are always looking, how am I going to make myself better? How am I going to fix the chassis? How am I going to make it look better? But self-compassion says, I accept what is here, as it is here. And I'm able to welcome it for its flaws, its brokenness, its vulnerability. It's all welcome here. And when I wrote my book on grief, I said that one of the outcomes of doing grief work is compassion for others. But what I didn't say in the book is that in order to grieve our own grief, we have to practice self-compassion. That my losses matter. That what happened to me matters. Part of what happens is we begin this horrible process of comparison. Well, I'm not suffering as much as they are, and they had it. And we begin to disqualify our own grief. But no matter what your sorrow is, it is worthy of your attention. So it's something, again, that's not an event, it is an ongoing practice. And when I have this amazing privilege of working with the Cancer Help Program in Commonweal in Bolinas, in Marin, a couple times a year. I spend a week with 8 cancer patients. And towards the end of the week, I give them these 10 practices to optimize the healing response of their body and their soul to the cancer. And I say you can do these in any order you want, except for number 1. Number 1 is number 1, and that is self-compassion. There is no healing journey without self-compassion. You cannot turn yourself into a project, an agenda, a mission. You have to come at yourself with the deepest and most brave heart of courage to be with what is here. And the last part of your apprenticeship is remembering your wild entanglement with the world. Remembering your wild entanglement with the world. So I remember back in 2020, and I think it was October, and the election was coming up, and I was getting pretty depressed that the outcome would be similar to it was 4 years ago. And I was bordering on despair, just about to get into bed, when something turned me around, quite literally. I felt it was my soul, turned me around, took me to one of my bookshelves, reached up for a book of essays by a Chickasaw poet, author by the name of Linda Hogan. And the book was called Dwellings. And I opened the book randomly to the page that said all my relations. And I realized I had forgotten all my relations. I was a single solitary cell in that moment, cut off from the stars, from the moon, from the turtles and the salmon, from the redwoods and the oak, from the salamanders, from the birds. I was cut off from everything. So in that moment, I imaginally extended my filaments of connection back out to everything that I am connected to, as are you. And the despair instantly vanished. So we cannot possibly do ongoing grief work without remembering this wild entanglement with everything that is. We are part rose and part sunset and part magnolia and part sparrow. We are part of that living tissue of the world. So I don't know how we're doing here because we started a little bit late. Should I just keep going for 5 more minutes, or what do you think, Rick?
Yeah, 5 minutes, sure.
5 minutes? Yeah. We can hang in there for 5 more minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. How about an hour? Okay. So what do we need to What do we need to honor our grief? What's required for that, for honoring? The first thing I do want to come back to is community. That grief in our long story as a species has always been communal. It has never been private. When people again come to my office to a private practice, right? They start working with me, and I say to them, not all of them, but those who are capable of it, I say, this is a really good place to learn how to tolerate contact with grief and with witnessing. But ultimately, you will need a larger holding space for you to fully move this grief down. And that's what we're waiting for, is the community to say, I see you. I'm with you. We're all in this together. When we open our grief ritual weekends, we begin, just doing a around the circle share, like one thread of grief you came in the door with. Usually people have a ball of yarn, worth of grief, but just one thread. And by the time we're around the room, 30, 40 people, I'll ask, was anything shared that you could not relate to? No. You may not have had a suicide of a child or a partner or the death of a beloved spouse or loss of a home or a pet that you just were endeared to. But you all know about loss. That is the commons of the soul. So I'll say what we're going to learn over this weekend is that this is our grief, not yours alone. But that's your part of the communal cup of grief. This is our shared sorrow. When we had the fires, the first really big fire up in Santa Rosa, where we lost over 6,000 homes and 21 lives, I was asked to lead a grief ritual for the community, and there were a lot of people there, so we put large bowls of water surrounded by stones, small stones. People were invited to come up to the bowl of water and speak a sorrow into the stone and then put it in the bowl. And you quickly began to see, my grief isn't alone. My grief is with yours and yours and yours and all of yours. This is our grief. This is the shared cup of grief. We carry our grief so privately. So we have to begin to imagine and think like a village again. Think like a community. What would that look like to share your grief? So you don't need something as elaborate as we do for our 3-day weekends. You can just invite a few people over to your house and share a poem and say, we're going to talk about grief tonight. As long as we don't try to fix each other. Grief is not a problem to be solved. It's a presence awaiting witnessing. And when we can give that witnessing to one another's grief, it can move. It doesn't have to stay locked and fixed as to where it is. Ira Progoff, the founder of the journal process, he said, this is the solitary journey you cannot do alone. I like that phrase. No one can walk your grief for you, but you cannot do it alone. We were not designed this way. We were designed perfectly inadequate. We have gifts and we have wounds. We have genius and we have vulnerability. And we were designed in a call and response kind of ecology. That when your wound shows up, it calls forth my medicine. When my wound comes up, your gifts come forward. We want to feel spiritually employed, which is also part of our grief. We don't feel spiritually employed. Second thing we require is ritual ground. We need powerful containment fields capable of holding the most intense, raw emotions that we carry. And those basically don't exist, particularly in white culture. There are some black churches that you can go to a funeral and you can fall to the ground and you will be held. But it's very rare for us to have that kind of intense ritual ground. And certain things can only happen in ritual fields because the containment field has been set up intentionally, purposefully, for the invitation for you to bring in what is wanting to be expressed. And again, this is a universal architecture. You can look any place around the planet and this is what is designed, is to create a field of space capable of holding what needs to move. Two things are required to set grief down: containment and release. Not very complicated, but when you're doing it by yourself, you can't do both jobs at the same time. You're stuck between containment and containment. You become a permanent containment field for your grief. You may have noticed you're recycling a lot of the same grief that has been there for decades. It's still waiting for that signal frequency. When the community shows up and the ritual ground has been set up, something in our deep archaic psyche, what Jung called the unforgotten wisdom at the core of the psyche, the unforgotten wisdom. It's deep in our beings to recognize this. And there's been many times at the end of the ritual, someone will say, well, that was unusual. I've never done anything like that before, but it felt oddly familiar. Now, what is that? But the archaic mind, the deep soul, our ancestral inheritance that recognizes this is how we did it. We gathered in circles. We wept side by side. We were welcomed back from the work we did in the well of grief. It wasn't a solitary, isolated journey. I remember going to a CEU class at Spirit Rock. It was a wonderful class by Rick Hansen. People probably know Rick Hansen, his work with neuropsychology and Buddha's brain, and doing some great work around that. And he was teaching us all these internalized practices for how do you process intense fields of grief or trauma or anxiety. And I'm thinking, these are brilliant. But for several 100,000 years, the regulating principle was ritual and community. That was the original place you went to when there was trauma. It was the community that held you. In this village in Africa that I was in, there was a young woman there who had a burn scar across half her face. So I asked my friend, what happened? Just out of curiosity. I was interested because she was probably the most joyous person I think I've ever met. She was so ebullient, so delighted in life. And he said, oh, it was terrible. He said, her mother threw boiling water on her in a fit of rage. I said, well, what happened then? Well, the whole community got around this girl and said, this had nothing to do with you. You are beautiful. You are ours. You are loved. You are cherished. And I saw a wound remain superficial, skin deep. It did not penetrate to her soul and become a narrative of her worthlessness. How many of us have had moments of trauma, incidents of violence or violation to our being, and no one there to mirror back to us? This had nothing to do with you. You are beautiful. You are lovely. You are worthy. You belong. And so her wound never became part of her narrative. Right? We need to slow down to the speed of ritual and to enter into what my mentor Clark Berry called that geologic speed, right? To slow down to that speed, to let soul catch up to us. We need beauty and imagination. We cannot deal with grief without beauty. Beauty is one of those things that Hillman said that beauty is the means by which the gods touch the senses, reach the heart, and attract us into life. So what is it that attracts you into life if no beauty is there? And so to have beauty at the same time as grief is really crucial. I was working with a woman who was grieving the war in Iraq, and she was literally on the floor of my office. She kind of fell off the couch and was just sobbing, and I let her cry for 15, 20 minutes. And then I leaned down close to her ear and I whispered, did you happen to notice the plum blossoms are out? And she said, no. I said, did you happen to notice that the mustard was in bloom? And she said, no. I said, well, we can't possibly tolerate the horrors of the war without plum blossoms and mustard blooms. It's medicine for us. in crucial times. So my final thought is another passage of Hillman's where he said, the world and the gods are dead or alive according to the condition of our souls. The world and the gods are dead or alive according to the condition of our souls. In other words, to keep this animate world humming and green, we have to keep our souls alive and fed and juicy. So that's part of our work with the apprenticeship, is to keep the circulation moving of sorrow so it doesn't turn ourselves cold and hardened, and then the world itself will grow dead and not alive. Jung said that each of us is a make-weight in the coming future of our planet. We are each make-weights. In other words, you each matter. Every one of us in this room matters as to what the shape of the world will be in the coming decades. Most of us won't see that farther shore of the long dark. I know I won't. But some of us might in this room. Some of you younger ones might see that. So we have to become a make-weight. I have to do everything I can on any given day to ensure that the green world remains, that the salmon return, whatever I can do in my way to respond to the world. Jung said, embrace your grief, for there your soul will grow. I like that. So, anybody here ever been in therapy? Forever? Well, I think what the apprenticeship reminds us of is that the work you're doing internally is now being asked to be expressed also in the world. You're being called to become soul activists, to not only do your work inside, but also to find ways of applying that medicine outward. In those 10 practices I offered to the cancer people, number 10 was service. I would say to them, after your long journey with cancer, you will realize that what you went through was not meant for you alone, nor is your therapy meant for you alone. At some point and in some way, you must give yourself away. Give the medicine that you've gathered, the wisdom that has come to you. It is time to give it away. So I'll close this with a poem by Greg Kimura called Cargo. Your entire life, a ship laden with meaning, purpose, and gifts. You enter life, a ship laden with meaning, purpose, and gifts, sent to be delivered to a hungry world. And as much as the world needs your cargo, you need to give it away. Everything depends on this. But the world forgets its needs, and you forget your mission, and the ancestral maps used to guide you have become faded scrawls on the parchments of dead pharaohs. The cargo weighs you heavy the longer it is held. Spoilage becomes a risk. The ship sputters from port to port, and at each you ask, is this the way? But the way cannot be found without knowing the cargo, and the cargo cannot be known without recognizing there is a way. It is simply this. You have gifts. The world needs your gifts. You must deliver them. The world may not know it is starving, but the hungry know, and they will find you when you discover your cargo and start to give it away. Thank you.
So for discussion, here's how things are going to work. There's a microphone on each side of the room. The volunteers with mics, can you just show your microphones? And when the red button on the mic is lit, that means it's on. So the volunteers will pass the mics around to anybody on each side who has a question. Just raise your hand or stand up. That would be even better, so that I can also point the camera towards you for our Zoom viewers. And then for the people joining us on Zoom, Francis has asked for you to put your questions in the chat room. I will read them to everybody here, and also to please make your questions concise. Okay?
One at a time. Come on.
Hi, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Between the stages of the apprentice and the master is another stage of the journeyman.
Mm-hmm.
What does that look like?
I think that's the beginning process of actually touching the material, working with the material, working with grief, beginning to come to grief rituals, beginning to ease off the mantle of isolation, of individualism, where you begin to become part of the village mind. You begin to become part of the craft, but you're not prepared to offer the craft yet. You're still learning the ways of the craft. So there's a long time where you come and you weep, you weep, you weep. You become skillful in knowing how to walk into that space. It took me 3 grief rituals before I shed my first tear. And I've went to many grief rituals before I had the audacity to think that I could actually hold that space. So that journeyman time, the journey person's time, is becoming familiar with the ground, of learning how to work with the material in your own body, your own soul, and how to support others. When we're doing the grief rituals, we often say, to learn how to think like a village means that you might not grieve today, because it's hard to grieve on demand, right? Okay, we're starting the ritual, it's, come on. But somebody else might grieve in the community. And can you support them while they're grieving? So can you be a place of welcome when they return? Can you go down to the shrine with them and be their support person while they're grieving? So you begin to learn that the chairs will switch many times over the course of rituals. This might not be your time, but next time it will be. And then who will be there for you? So we begin to learn, again, that etiquette of collaborative mind so that we hold each other. So that's a lot of part of what that journey, that middle phase is actually working with the ground. Yeah, good question. Thank you.
Susanna from the Zoom room asks, can you speak of the relationship between grief and shame?
Yeah, it shows up frequently in the sense of not feeling adequate, not feeling worthy of honoring your own losses, your own grief. In the 5 gates of grief, I write about the second gate of grief is the parts of us that have never known love. And one of the primary means by which pieces of us are splintered off is through shame. So I lost my anger, I lost my sensuality, I lost my exuberance, I lost my tenderness, I lost so many parts of me through shame. So that my work then, well, one more comment about that. So when people come into therapy, or when I went into therapy, the primary goal is to reclaim lost parts of ourselves. But it's hard to grieve over something that I now have learned to hold with contempt. I have learned to judge these parts of me as worthless, as despicable. My opening comment to my long-term therapist was, well, I want you to help me get rid of some parts of me. If I could just get rid of the weakness and the shame and, the inadequacy and the neediness, if I could just get rid of those parts, I'd be acceptable. I'd be tolerable in the community. But that very process would have ruptured my integrity as a human being. So shame is one of those primary wounds that make it very hard both to grieve and then to welcome back what has been outcast, what I call outcast parts of ourselves. One more comment about that is I did a 5-week series, I think sometime last year, called An Apprenticeship with Sorrow. And then there's another series called the 5 Gates of Grief. And as I was preparing for that, I was writing about the outcasts in my notes. And my hand mysteriously wrote the word outpost instead. And I looked at that and go, outpost, outpost. What does that mean? And as I sat with it, I realized that even my judgment of these parts of myself that were outcast carried my projection of shame, that they were beleaguered, drooling, unworthy parts of me, and that I had to kind of mercifully bring them back. No, they were outposts. They were holding the farthest edge of my unlived life. And if I had the courage to go on pilgrimage to my neediness, my weakness, my shame, my loneliness, I might become immense. Rather than trying to huddle them back in as a broken mass of, disheveled creatures. So I now see these parts as outposts, not as outcasts. They are the parts waiting for me to enter into their aliveness so that I might live into the full circumference of what I was meant to live. So I hope we touched your question.
Thank you very much. One of the questions, a question that I have is the idea of hope in the midst of the chaos and the despair. And one of the, a hope that I have right now is that women are stepping forward.
Yeah.
And that to me is really deep and really hopeful. And I think for the earth and for humanity and for the structures, the power structures. So could you comment on that in our reality right now, and where you see that? Or do you see it the way I see it, or maybe not, or it's all going to end up anyway?
Well, I often say this is a time for courage and faith. Courage to keep our hearts open to what's happening, and faith that there's something intelligible in terms of what's happening. Like the long dark is intelligible. We can see that there are things happening. Hope is a precarious thing in the sense that it's often carried in the wrong hands. It's often carried in the hands of the child inside of us, a young part, hoping that we can escape what's in front of us. The hope you're talking about is the kind I like. It's carried by adults, trying to shape a future, trying to stay engaged with that future. So hope is based on an adult presence, an adult engagement, not a passive wish that things will turn out right. This is a time of engagement. So thank you for asking that question.
Another question from the Zoom room. Could you expand on your comment, sorrow could have been the 13th fairy tale?
Well, what I meant by that is that in the fairy tales, there's usually a story of a feast being held, and for a wedding or for some special event, and the king and queen in the fairy tale remember to invite almost all the fairies, but they forget one. And out of that slight, that 13th fairy shows up anyhow and usually casts a curse on the princess or the prince, or something happens to ruin the party. What I meant by that 13th fairy around grief is that we may not invite it to the party, but it's always going to show up. And when we don't invite it, when we don't welcome it, it comes in ways that disrupt and cause really difficulties in our life. So rather than trying to find ways to avoid the entanglement with grief, how do we take up our apprenticeship and become more skillful in being able to engage it, not again in isolation, but in community, with all of the principles we talked about today, so that it becomes, again, like Rilke said, part of the revelation, part of the transformation of who we are. Grief, when it's received, will work you and change you radically. You become immense. Again, when I'm working with the cancer people, a lot of their conditioning and their medical terminology is stay positive, stay hopeful, stay, whatever else you want to put over your love. I said, but isn't fear here too? Isn't grief here too? Isn't death in the vicinity? Isn't dread in the vicinity? I said, this time in your life, in your work with cancer, you are being asked to become immense. You have to get your arms around all of these. Otherwise, these will become the things that cause the most difficulty in your healing journey. The things we reject, even Freud said that, right? The repressed returns. So whatever we try to push away, my characterization of that is whatever we hate tends to dominate. So if I can change my relationship to these things, come into more of a companionship, even if it's a difficult one, we become larger and more capable of welcoming all that is, all that's there. Yeah.
I'm not sure if I have a fully formed question here. My sense of like a traditional or conventional understanding of grief and some of the complexities of it is that we have a hard time letting go. And I'm wondering about like the inverse of that, when maybe we too easily let go. And yeah, like I'm thinking this notion of like spiritual bypass, right? Where it's like too quickly rushing to a sort of like this wider view of, well, there's creation and destruction, and we just,
Right.
and that being kind of a place of safety to kind of pull back quickly to avoid and risk like engaging with and feeling into and being connected into life and like the people that are here now or not here now. So I'm just wondering if you could speak to that, like that, and I don't know, in your experience, if that's a common thing or if it really is people are kind of white knuckling it, trying to grip so tightly, but when the opposite is the problem, that they're not holding on hard enough.
Well, I think you spoke that very beautifully. Thank you. I think that bypass is still the remnants of individualism. Spirituality frequently is something we do to transcend and move beyond. Again, those people walking past our workshop, it's so negative in there. It's like we don't know that it's okay to go into that room. And so we want to have some capacity to negotiate that territory and find out its value. What is the value? What is the beauty? What is the holiness that's in that darkness? Rather than trying to find our way past it. In the alchemical tradition, they talked about when the Negredo begins, the goal is to make the black blacker than black, to go deeper into the darkness until you touch the sol niger, the black sun. Now that's very different than enlightenment, right? The rising. And nothing wrong with enlightenment, by the way. Nothing wrong with seeking spiritual insight. But what we are weak at culturally is going into that darkness and seeing the work that goes on in that place of grief and tenderness and vulnerability and not knowing. That's the place we're in right now, right? We're in Kartsaluni. We don't know what's going to happen. We have enough idea what's going to come down the pike. But we do need to be ready to entertain the darkness and be informed by it, to not bypass it, to not let it go too easy, to conceptual ideas. But what does it feel like in your body? I was doing a online conversation with Dwayne and his partner Colleen. And you can, by the way, you can get this free of charge as a PDF at choosingearth.org, in case you're interested. I was doing a Zoom seminar with them online, and a woman asked the question, what do I do with deniers? Climate deniers. I said, you prepare a space for them when the denial is no longer possible. Rather than trying to convince them, tell them that they're wrong, at some point, the world will teach us what is the truth of the situation. There will be no bypass. There will be no way to explain it away. We'll have to confront the world as it is. And that's when these skills become so critical. How did you show up for this? Thank you for that. Excellent question.
Hey, thank you for coming.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really enjoy all the questions that just came because they have a lot of swirling around sort of the same particular theme. It sounds like I'm kind of going in of feeling the grief, being with it. My questions and my personal sort of, I guess, questions, research, struggle is outside of, obviously the grief rituals have a very specific container. They have a really amazing function, for lack of a better word. Without that, or in between that, or an absence of those containers, when you're going into and you're allowing yourself to feel sorrow, to be sad, to have grief, I don't know exactly the phrasing, but like basically, when is enough, or what are the questions you're asking yourself in those spaces, and maybe make it a bit more explicit. Like, for me, if I'm saying, okay, I'm going to let myself be sad or in grief, and you go there and it's not great, which is part of the process, but especially in the world we live in, we have lots of things to do, and you say, okay, well, I need to do work now, so like, can we get on with this, or can we leave this? And I think that also plays a lot into the self-compassion as rule one, what you're saying, is because there seems to be a tension or conflict there of saying, like, I can stay here and be sad and sort of I'm not sure what is going to happen, but also I have these other things to do, and can we get on with life, or can you stop being so sad right now so we can go do this?
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the premises in your question is that grieving is not getting on with life.
Understood how that could be received. I think it is sometimes in tension or conflict with other things that are
There will
somewhat
be.
timely.
There
Yeah.
will be.
Yeah.
There's many ways we could try to sit with that. One of them is the terrible lack of courtesy we have to grief in the culture. Like, think about our bereavement processes here of, well, we'll give you, a week or two, then get back to it. We're impatient. There's an alchemical phrase, in your patience is your soul. Can you be faithful with this grief? But you can also say to your grief, I will not forget you. I will not abandon you. I will be faithful to you. And for the next 5 hours, I need to do this. But make sure you come back. That you keep up that rhythm of attention. The soul is primarily concerned about neglect. So as long as we keep some core relational pattern going with it, we can speak to it, and it will be patient with us. But make sure you keep coming back.
Thank you.
And usually people say, well, I've been doing this for so long. Listen, I remember, I think it was Jack Kornfield saying, well, then you're about halfway there. And the other thing too is that right now, much of what we're grieving isn't yours. It's not personal. What's in our bodies right now is the collective sorrows, the shape of our culture right now, or the lack of any shape to our culture, and what's happening to our watersheds. And we hope to see a salmon swim through our creek. We hope for that. Well, to miss that, we were talking, my wife and I were just talking, how fewer songbirds are around our house. We live in the woods, smack dab in the redwoods and the oak trees and the Doug fir, and there's usually a lot of bird life. But what's happening is that there's no bugs. I got maybe 3 mosquito bites this summer. There's nothing for the birds to eat. So we're watching this dwindling of the insect population down like 60%. The collapse of the insect population. So the birds have nothing to eat, so they can't stay there. Where do you put that? It's not separate from your body, but it's not personal in the sense of your experiences of suffering and loss, but it is, right? So, to have a grief shrine where you acknowledge the threads of grief that are moving through your life. And maybe you have a core group of 4 or 5 friends that once a month gathers to acknowledge what weight are you carrying today? And can we just help you hold it? But not take it on as a solo enterprise. Find support. I do believe that much of the grief we're carrying right now is not ours. As Rumi said, it began in some other tavern. So, one more? What do you think?
Sure, let's take one final one from the Zoom room. Can you give an example or two of the simple grief rituals people could share with others?
Yeah, the one I mentioned, the stone ritual, is a very, very powerful, simple ritual. If it's a group of, 5 to 10 people, you just put a nice, good-sized bowl of water in the middle of the room. And you decide how you want to do it. You can either take turns going up to the bowl. You can take turns speaking aloud what it is you're grieving. And then just begin to, communally place your stones into the bowl until you all feel in that moment that that's what I'm carrying today. Another one that we've done in the past is, that's a little more complicated, but the taking it out to the earth. Sometimes some cultures have this ritual where you dig a hole in the ground and you bring offerings to the ground. Flower petals, cornmeal, tobacco, whatever you want to bring, and you speak your sorrows into the ground. You speak it into the earth. She's big enough to hold this. Not only that, she knows how to metabolize it into nutrients for the trees and the green things. She knows how to take our sorrows and turn it into sweetness, into green things. So laying on your belly, usually witnessed, have people with you, take your turns. Laying on your belly, feel your body connected to that ground and speak your grief into the earth. Bellow it. One thing I haven't mentioned today is grief is not just tears. It is also outrage. Driving in today, we saw several thousand people on the Golden Gate Bridge protesting, standing up for the women of Iran. It was powerful to witness. Group after group after group of people standing, protesting, right? Grief is a form of protest. It's a refusal to live numb and small and deadened. It's a refusal to fit in to what culture describes as your only space that you can occupy. So this is not just a personal, internal process. It's also how we stay vitally alive and engaged with the world. Protest, outrage. Hillman said, if a sure sign that your soul is awake is that it's outraged. It is pissed off about what it's seeing. And then we have to find our ways to respond to that. All right. Thank you so much, Colleen and Rick and all of you for coming in today and sitting beautifully with this time. And thank you, all of you online, for joining us. And many blessings.